Hi, welcome to Classic Guitar Rock. Here's an update for today, March 7th, 2023. Man, a lot has happened since our last get together last Thursday, I think. And we'll get to that, but I do have 3 emails that I want to get to. Please email me, by the way, classicguitarrock@mail.com. Love to hear from you and share your email here. So let's hop into these emails. First one, Dear CGR, this is a big argument between my friend and I. Was grunge ultimately good for rock music or bad for it? My friend is a huge grunge fan and thinks it was a great thing. Me, not so much. Thanks. Doug. Doug, thanks for your email. There was a similar email last week about grunge. Your email, when I read it this yesterday, I got it a few days ago, it prompted me to put up a poll on my Twitter. In fact, you can follow us on Twitter at Classic Guitar R1 is our handle on Twitter. And I just put up a poll that said, it's basically grunge, yes or no, do you like it or not? And the actual results, that's not quite closed. I think there's still a couple hours left, but right now the majority of folks like grunge. They said that it was just a yes or no, right? Yes or no. And so far the yes vote is ahead of the no vote, which, to be honest, kind of surprised me. I thought it would be a tighter. There's still I think it's about 40% say no, so it's a 60-40. I kind of thought it would be closer than that, or maybe even that the no vote would be higher. And I think it kind of breaks along age. I think people that are probably in their 40s that really lived through grunge in high school, they probably really like it. Because again, it's the music that they associate with their teenage years. That's usually how it seems to break out. I was already, in my early to mid 20s when grunge really broke. And this is not to say that there aren't some good grunge bands. There are obviously some talented people, but I would have been one of those that probably said, no, grunge was not good for music, because grunge, I've talked about it on the last week when we had a similar question about grunge, how there have always been these musical waves, right? Where one new form of music, punk, did it to the progressive rock of the 70s. Hard rock had to come in and squash disco. Same type of thing, right? But the grunge overreaction was huge. I mean, to the point that bands that went from multi-platinum albums to the next album, the record companies would drop them. Oh no, this is not what we want to do anymore. We want to do grunge, right? So from that standpoint, as a fan of rock and roll, of classic rock, I thought grunge was a bad thing, just because it was kind of artificial, right? It wasn't that these bands that were put out to pasture, it wasn't that they sucked. And yeah, there were some excesses. I mean, hair metal was getting kind of ridiculous, and I get that. But there were great bands. Night Ranger is a good example. Rat, a good example, that were viable in the late 80s, early 90s, and then all of a sudden grunge comes out and no more. The record companies wouldn't support their albums. That's not what they wanted to push. I was watching an interview with Jack Blades where he says that Damn Yankees, who had 2 very successful albums right when grunge was happening, the record company actually paid them not to record a 3rd album. Because in their contract was, when it's time for your 3rd album, we'll pay you $1 million just to come in and record it, right? Well, the record company at that point, this is probably 93, 94, whenever this happened, even though the first 2 Damn Yankees albums had been very successful, they didn't want to push it and promote it, because that's not what they were doing at that time. Grunge, the Seattle sound, was what they were doing, right? So they actually paid them $1 million not to record a 3rd album. And they're like, okay. because that's just the way that the music industry was going. Here's what the music industry did at that time. Thank goodness, and a lot of this is because of the internet. It's kind of changed it, but and streaming companies are doing the same thing to movie studios, right? But in the '90s, the way you made money in the music biz, you had to get a record deal, and there were only a few record labels, relatively speaking, and they called the shots. Here are the bands we're booking. Oh, Nirvana was popular. Let's book other, cookie cutter bands like Nirvana, or, Alice in Chains is popular. Let's get another band from Seattle. And that's what we want. Same thing happened in the mid 80s with hair metal, right? So the record companies, movie companies have very little imagination, very few good ideas. It's let's copy what's been successful and let's make everything, it's a cookie cutter. Let's make everything like that, right? So that meant there were still a lot of good viable rock bands that there was still an audience for them, but that's not what the record companies wanted to do. We want to push this grunge thing. And so, yes, there were some good grunge bands, but there was a lot of crap. And I guess my problem with grunge is it kind of killed off some good rock stuff that would have been happening had grunge not happened. I've mentioned one of my favorite bands or albums of all time, a band you've never heard of called The Sighs, Sighs. They had this album that came out in 91 or 92 called What Goes On. And had grunge not happened, I think it would have been a multi-platinum record. Okay, it's kind of a power pop, kind of alternative leaning, but it's very hooky, very jangly guitars, awesome vocals, a good producer. I mean, it had all the things necessary to be a hit album. 4 or 5 songs on that album just sound like radio hits. And right after it was released, well, Nirvana came, grunge took over, and the record companies weren't pushing that. It's all grunge all the time. That's what we're going to do, right? So, and so grunge, and it's not the band's faults. They were looking for an opportunity just like the rock bands, the regular hard rock bands were. But it's the record companies that really pushed this Seattle sound, this grunge sound. And so for several years in the 90s, that's all we got, right? It's interesting, though, now you kind of come full circle. And now these I'll call them nostalgia tours, right? These nostalgia tours where you go see Journey and Styx and Joan Jett and Cheap Trick, they are huge. The arena tour last year with Motley Crue and Def Leppard and Poison, giant, massive tours, right? You don't see the alternative bands that were big in 94 doing that sort of thing. I'm trying to think, can you go see Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains in an arena? Maybe you can. I don't know. I don't seem to see that, right? There seems to be a resurgence of a lot of these old bands, as the fans are now in their 50s, right? They still want to go out and see a good, hard rock band like a Night Ranger, or Def Leppard. Def Leppard has still puts on great shows. So did I answer your question? Was grunge a great thing or a bad thing? I don't know if I want to say it was a bad thing. I would say that the reaction of the record companies was very heavy-handed in that they basically just threw the good rock bands that were still putting out good stuff overboard to get in bed with all the Seattle stuff. That was when all the good rock bands, the popular rock bands that had Queensryche, who was huge in 91, that was kind of their downfall, right? Was the grunge thing. And then you saw a lot of these bands tried to react to it. I'm thinking of Dokken, right? So Dokken puts out an album that's almost like grunge, and it didn't work, right? Because they were trying to just then, jump on the coattails of this grunge sound, and so they make these sludgy sound. That's not Dawkins, right? But what else are they going to do if that's all that record companies want? It's a kind of a catch-22. So I won't say that grunge was bad. It was a natural thing. You know, the hair metal was getting kind of ridiculous. But it was a bad thing in that it did in the careers of a lot of great rock bands too soon. The good news is many of those great rock bands are coming back now. There's a resurgence, right? And you know, so we still get to hear that stuff. Now, what has changed in all of this is radio. Radio's not like it was, not near as powerful as it used to be. We don't have, you know, a few record labels that dictate what people buy. Now, the barrier of entry is so much lower. Look at someone like Billie Eilish. Now, I'm not really a huge Billie Eilish fan, but here's what's interesting about Billie Eilish. Here's a multi-platinum artist that produced that record, recorded that record in their bedroom with her brother, right? Her and her brother recorded this record in their bedroom. No multi-million-dollar studio, and this huge and obviously very talented. She is, her brother is. He's kind of unsung in all of this. YouTubers, Justin Bieber got his start on YouTube, right? So now there are ways to get your music to the masses going around traditional record companies, right? The days of these bloated tours like Led Zeppelin in the 70s and these massive, they're gone, right? Where you have your own jet and you're flying, because the structure, radio's different. You know, record companies are different. They don't have those huge budgets like they used to have because they're not the only game in town anymore. So it's really changed the face of music. There are pros to that. There are cons to that. But getting back to your original question, was grunge bad? I don't want to say it was bad, but I'll say that one of the negatives of grunge was it did make some good rock bands go away too early. That's kind of my thought. And I'm just not a huge grunge fan. You know, I would much rather have listened to even hair metal than most grunge. That's just me. I just mentioned Night Ranger. Hey, Jeremy, one of my favorite bands was Night Ranger. What are your thoughts on them? That's from Robert. Robert, I love Night Ranger. I mentioned the interview I saw with Jack Blades talking about Night Ranger. I thought they were great. My first exposure to Night Ranger, I saw Ozzy Osbourne, the Diary of a Madman tour in June of 1982. So this was after Randy had died. And the guitar player on that Diary tour was Brad Gillis. And so that was one of the very first concerts I attended. And that image was burned in my mind of Brad Gillis up there, you know, playing his red Strat, all black, his curly hair, you know, whammy bar, all, you know, it was just burned, etched into my brain. And then fast forward just a few months later, we got MTV on the cable station. I lived at Fort Sill, Oklahoma at the time. So I saw Ozzy in Spokane in June. Then in July, we moved back to Oklahoma. We got MTV installed like in August of 82. And of course, at that time, there's this video by a band called Night Ranger called Don't Tell Me You Love Me. And I knew instantly when I saw that video, I said, that's the guitar player who was with Ozzy. Because again, he was burned into my mind. I saw the guy playing he wasn't wearing the black leather like he was with Ozzy. He's wearing some stripy 80s crap, but it was him. And so right from the beginning, I was like all over Night Ranger. And, you know, I'm listening to Night Ranger Dawn Patrol, and then Speak of the Devil comes out later that year. They both feature Brad Gillis. So I was way in on Night Ranger. You Can Still Rock in America. I remember when what was that album called? Midnight Madness? Midnight Madness, I think their second album. Great album, cranked it, love Night Ranger, and they're still out touring, and you can check out videos on YouTube. They still sound great. They've got all the original members except one. So Jeff Watson has not been part of their latest thing. Joel Hoekstra was in the band for a while. Now their second guitarist, I don't know what his name is, but he's great. The whole band is great. Any interviews I've seen with any of them, they just seem like cool guys, and I love Night Ranger. I think they're awesome. Okay, here's my last email. Hey guys, just checked out an episode from a while back about the Cars debut album. That is one of my all-time favorite albums and brings back so many memories from high school, but I have to be honest, I saw them live in the 80s. I think it was the Heartbeat City album, and they were kind of disappointing in concert. But as far as albums go, the first one was really good. Thanks for your podcast. Okay, I have never seen the Cars live. That's from Derek J. in Hollister, California. Thank you, Derek. I've never seen the Cars live, but I, like you, think that debut album of the Cars is one of the, it's in my top 5 albums of all time. I love it. I love that album. Their second album, Candy-O, is a good album, not close to the first one. Panorama, not close to the first one. Shake It Up, not close. I mean, they had one phenomenal album followed by 3 or 4 good albums. None of them are bad, but none of them stand up to that first album. And as much as I love that first album, I tend to agree with you. Again, I've never seen them live in person, but I've watched a lot of live footage of them. And part of it, I think, is their style. Their style was meant to be kind of aloof, and cool, so there's not a lot of stage presence. And I think that was just kind of part of who they were. Rick Ocasek was a very aloof. You're never going to see the Cars run around on stage and do all that. You see a little animation from Elliot Easton, right? But for the most part, it's all kind of stand in one place and don't smile and don't talk and just be cool, right? And that often translates into kind of a boring show, right? So I agree with you. Live, they're not very engaging. I mean, their music's great. They've got some great songs, but that first album that has these killer guitar tones and keyboard tones, and Roy Thomas Baker was the producer who also produced Queen, so you get these excellent vocal mixes, and that doesn't always translate as well in the live setting. But yeah, as much as I love that first Cars album, I'm not a huge fan of them live. And I hate to say this, but one of my other favorite bands that I love their albums, but they're just not that good live, making sure no one hears, ZZ Top. Love ZZ Top to death. I've seen them live about 4 or 5 times. And every time I leave a ZZ Top show, I'm like, that was okay. I've never been blown away by them live. I don't know what it is. And then on the other hand, there are other bands that the magic happens live. Cheap Trick live is way better than any Cheap Trick album. That's just the way it plays out. There are live bands and there are studio bands, right? And it doesn't mean one's better or worse. In fact, I generally prefer, this was a recent question I asked on my Twitter as well. Do you prefer studio albums or live albums? Well, I prefer studio albums, right? So I guess, I'd rather have a band that's puts out excellent studio albums and are lame live than not so great studio albums and great live albums. I don't know. It's just kind of a funny thing. But thank you so much for your email, Derek. All right. I want to get to a few news items, and I lost my, here it is. I lost my headlines here. So it's such a bummer to talk about people dying, but classic rock, the purveyors of classic rock are all getting older. So it's only natural that there are people that will be passing away. So a few people, David Lindley, who's a guitarist for Jackson Browne, kind of a multi-instrumentalist, plays slide guitar. The Jackson Browne song Stay. I think he's actually also the one that sings the really high falsetto. Oh, why don't you stay at the end. But he's a phenomenal slide guitarist. He plays kind of an eclectic mix of, plays all kinds of instruments. But primarily he's known as a guitarist, and he's done some solo albums, kind of rootsy Americana type albums. Very talented guy. He passed away. Also, Leonard Skinner guitarist Gary Rosington died at the age of 71 on the 5th. He had been sick for a long time, and he passed away. So our condolences to David Lindley and his family, and to Gary Rosington and his family. Rosington, because he was part of Skynyrd, which was a huge band. There was a huge outpouring on social media from other musicians. Everyone from, Neil Schon in Journey to Hetfield in Metallica, lots of people from all different types of genres paying their respects to Gary Rosington. So that was a sad thing to hear. Another thing that I've been trying to find some details on this. I haven't been able to. There's a little back and forth, and hang on here. I'm trying to find it right now as we talk about. There's a little back and forth, and when I say that, much of it is created.
Hey, what's up, brother?
I call it a back and forth, but is it really a back and forth? They might not be thinking it. Nikki and Stephen Pearcy might not be thinking of it as a back and forth at all, but the media tries to play it up that way, right? Well, so apparently something came out about, Vince Neil of Motley Crue, he's been getting raked over the coals for the last few years about how bad he sounds live, right? He just vocally he can't do it. He can't sing anymore. And it's comical to hear him sing. Well, it's come out that apparently Nikki Sixx uses bass backing tracks, which is very ironic because Nikki Sixx, never known for being a great bass player to begin with, doesn't really play complicated bass parts. And so why would he need backing tracks on bass? That just seems ridiculous. Dude, you can't, I could go up and play his bass parts. I think anyone that's played bass for 6 months could. Is that snarky? Kinda, but it's true. They brought John 5 in to replace Mick Mars, and their talent level multiplied by 10 just bringing that one guy in, because they're very overrated. Sorry, got to say it. Motley Crue has always been overrated in terms of their musicianship. The best musicians that have ever been in the band are John 5 and John Corabi, right? Weren't even any of the original members, right? But Stephen Pearcy, he had some things to say about Nikki Sixx using bass tracks, and it was basically, what you'd expect is like, come on, man. Your fans don't want to pay to see you play, the bass equivalent of lip sync. They don't want that. They want to see you guys play live. And it's interesting because Stephen Pearcy has kind of had some issues with live, not like Vince Neil. There's one, I can only, to be honest, think of one situation where Stephen claims that he was on medication at the time, and he had a really bad performance. It was on video. Some people say he was just really drunk. Whatever the case, there is one video of him performing where he sounds pretty bad. But for the most part, when you go and look at Rat videos, and Stephen Pearcy's voice, he has a very unique voice. He's not a crooner, right? He's not a guy has to do all the vocal acrobatics. His style is not that style, but he's got a very unique voice. You can instantly tell it's Stephen Pearcy, and he still pulls that off live. I watched a video as recently about 2 weeks ago, and he sounds great. The band sounds great. It's not Rat, it's Steve and Pearcy, because Rat, they can't all work it out and come together. So Steve and Pearcy's out touring. And I think he sounds great. He sounds like Steve and Pearcy, right? Unlike Vince Neil, who sounds like, I don't know what he sounds like. It's not good. But so, yeah, a little back and forth between Steve and Pearcy and Nikki Sixx. Why would Nikki Sixx need backing tracks for his bass? Again, that kind of blows my mind. I'll try and get some more details on that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Can you tell I was a bigger Rat fan than Motley Crue fan? I really was. I think Rat was a way better band. However, and I've run polls and had people vote who's better, and Motley Crue always wins. But my personal opinion is Rat's a better band. I'd rather see Rat. By the way, I was listening to the Infestation album, which is only a few years old, 2015, 16, something like that when it came out. It's an excellent album. If you've never listened to the Infestation album, check it out. So anyways, just a few thoughts on the news. Thank you for your emails. Thank you for joining me today. And again, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, classicguitarrock@mail.com, and we'll see you on the next Classic Guitar Rock update. Bye-bye.